They arrived at the edge of the Texan plain in the pale light of early morning, a line of trucks grinding slowly to a halt beside a camp that seemed too orderly, too quiet, to belong to a nation at war. Dust settled over the convoy as the German prisoners climbed down, bracing themselves for the blows they had been told to expect. Many had imagined this moment during the long journey across the Atlantic, the anger of victors, the weight of retribution, the reckoning for a war that had consumed continents. Few believed they would meet anything else. Instead, the first guard who approached them reached calmly into his pocket and held out a pack of cigarettes. No threats, no raised voice, just an unexpected gesture offered with the same routine indifference one might show a traveler stepping off a train. For a long second, the prisoners didn't move. They simply stared at the American's outstretched hand, unsure whether it was a trick, a test, or something stranger still. Only when one man accepted the cigarette did the others realize they were witnessing something they had not prepared for: restraint. Beyond the gate, smoke rose from a field kitchen, the aroma of coffee drifting toward the bewildered column. Stainless urns stood in neat rows, steam lifting into the warm Texas air as though awaiting a group of guests, not defeated soldiers. For men who had marched through burned villages and broken cities, this tableau felt almost unreal. Their uniforms were torn, their boots worn thin, yet here, thousands of miles from the ruins of Europe, someone had taken time to boil water for them. American officers watched the scene quietly, clipboards tucked beneath their arms, each procedure carried out with deliberate adherence to the Geneva Convention. Instructions were issued in measured tones. Prisoners were counted, sorted, and directed toward barracks whose timber frames seemed improbably new. The contrast struck the Germans with an almost physical force. The war they had lived was brutal and intimate, but the war here was governed by rules that still held meaning. Some whispered that the Americans were hiding something. Others wondered if this courtesy was meant to unsettle them. But as they stood in silence, trying to reconcile these small acts of civility with the devastation they had left behind, a deeper irony began to take shape, an irony none of them could yet name. And in the stillness of that first morning, they did not know that this unexpected kindness would become the quiet force shaping everything that followed. From the outside, the camp's fences and watchtowers suggested a place defined by power. From the inside, the Germans discovered something colder, and in many ways more disarming: a system. The U.S. Army did not run its prisoner-of-war camps as arenas for revenge, but as moving parts in a vast logistical machine. Every form, every schedule, every inventory sheet testified to the same idea, that even in war there were procedures to be followed. Housing was not improvised. Barracks were built to standards drafted long before these men had been captured. Each hut held a set number of bunks, spaced according to regulation. Windows opened at prescribed angles. Blankets were counted and signed for. The prisoners noted that even the straw in their mattresses seemed measured, as if comfort and control had been calculated together. Rations arrived according to tables, not moods. Calories per man per day. Bread, beans, meat when available, all recorded in neat columns. The German soldiers, many of whom had eaten irregularly at the front, now received meals with unsettling predictability. There were no shouted insults at the serving line, no deliberate shortages to demonstrate dominance, just the metallic clatter of trays and the quiet efficiency of men obeying orders, written in manuals, not born of anger. In the camp infirmary, the rules cut deeper. When new prisoners arrived, wounded and exhausted, medical staff moved toward them with professional calm. A directive stated clearly, prisoners of war were to be treated before the personnel who guarded them, unless American lives were in immediate danger. To men who had seen civilians pushed aside for soldiers and enemies left unattended on battlefields, this hierarchy seemed inverted, almost incomprehensible. Captured officers were separated and housed according to their rank, mirroring a structure they knew well. They were given small privileges, the right to organize internal discipline, to hold roll calls, to manage certain disputes among their own men. The framework resembled that of the Wehrmacht, but under foreign authority and a different flag, it carried a new and unsettling message. Their identity as soldiers was still being recognized, even in defeat. Slowly, the German prisoners began to see patterns. The guards behaved differently, yet consistently. There were no sudden storms of cruelty followed by leniency, no arbitrary punishments to remind them of their helplessness. Instead, there was paperwork, inspections, routine. Fairness here did not arise from kindness, but from adherence to rules. Some men whispered at night that this was all a calculated facade, a psychological operation designed to soften them before interrogation. Surely, they reasoned, no enemy could be this measured without some hidden purpose. They waited for the moment when the mask would slip and the real intent would emerge. But day followed day, and the procedures did not change. The same lights out, the same head counts, the same doctor making his rounds with quiet indifference. The consistency itself became a quiet force, wearing away their assumptions not with argument, but with repetition. And as regulations continued to govern their every waking hour, the prisoners did not yet realize that this disciplined normality was preparing them for an even more profound confrontation, one not with American weapons, but with American society itself. For many of the prisoners, the first true moment of rupture came not with a speech or an order, but with the smell of bread, warm, yeasted, unmistakably fresh. It drifted across the compound as they lined up for their midday meal, carried by the slow churn of kitchen fans. Hot food, served without contempt, felt almost ceremonial. Men who had eaten from tin cans in frozen forests now held metal trays that filled with beans, meat, and slices of soft bread that collapsed under the pressure of a thumb. The act was ordinary for the Americans who ladled it out, but for the Germans, it carried the weight of something transformative, the realization that nourishment could arrive without humiliation. Beyond the mess hall stood the shower building, a simple structure of timber and steel, pipes rising toward the water tower overhead. Inside, steam clung to the walls, thick as morning mist, and for a few minutes each man stood alone beneath a stream of hot water that rinsed away months of grime, sweat, and battlefield residue. The sound of it, steady, patient, unfaltering, felt like a reminder of life before the war. Some lingered longer than they needed to, not out of disobedience, but because they feared the warmth might stop at any moment. American cooks worked to precise guidelines, issuing meals calculated to match the caloric intake of U.S. soldiers. There was no secret reduction, no punitive rationing. What the Americans ate, the Germans ate, adjusted only by availability. The prisoners noted this with the wary attention of men accustomed to scarcity, tracing patterns in each portion as though deciphering a message hidden in the daily bread. In the afternoons, the wooden recreation hall filled with muted conversation. From a corner table, a gramophone played American jazz, brass and reed instruments weaving lines of music unlike anything they had heard in barracks or trenches. The melodies were restless yet disciplined, foreign yet strangely comforting. Some prisoners listened with folded arms, others with cautious curiosity, and a few with the faintest smile, as if the music momentarily suspended the war outside the fence. Letters home soon carried descriptions that seemed almost unbelievable. Sons wrote to mothers about showers, concerts, and meals that arrived hot. Husbands assured wives that their captors followed rules with dispassionate consistency. These messages, filtered through censors yet still honest in tone, revealed a truth difficult for families in ruined cities to imagine: that captivity in America felt less like punishment and more like enforced distance from the war's devastation. And as the prisoners settled into this new rhythm of food, hygiene, and unexpected music, a quiet question began to surface, one that lingered in the space between comfort and confusion. Why, they wondered, would an enemy invest this much effort in treating them so well? What they could not yet see was that the answer lay far beyond the camp's perimeter, in the deeper fabric of the nation that now held them. Long before their transport ships crossed the Atlantic, the men now standing behind American fences had been prepared for a very different fate. In barracks from Hamburg to Tunis, training officers had warned them of Allied cruelty with the certainty of men repeating doctrine, not evidence. They spoke of enemy soldiers who despised Germans with unrestrained fury, of captors who would use starvation and humiliation as instruments of revenge. These warnings were delivered with the heavy authority of official truth, and most recruits, young and impressionable, absorbed them without question. Imagination did the rest. Nazi propaganda amplified the message with practiced precision. Posters, radio broadcasts, and military manuals painted the United States as a nation without discipline, a society corrupted by individualism and greed. Americans were described as culturally weak, morally confused, incapable of sacrifice. It was a portrait crafted for soldiers who needed to believe in their own superiority. Many never doubted it. On the eve of their deployment to North Africa or France, they carried this certainty like an invisible shield, convinced they were marching to face an enemy large in number but small in character. Lectures on prisoner-of-war expectations hardened these assumptions further. Recruits were told that capture meant degradation. Officers warned that Allied camps lacked order, that guards would treat Germans as subhuman. Better to resist until the last bullet, they said, than to surrender oneself to such chaos. By the time these men stepped onto foreign soil, their worldview had already been set. The Americans were not only adversaries, but embodiments of everything the Reich insisted was inferior. When the fighting ended for them, sometimes in a foxhole, sometimes in a shattered village, sometimes in a desert wadi, they carried this mental scaffolding into captivity. Even the act of raising their hands in surrender felt like stepping toward an expected darkness. Yet what awaited them was something they could not reconcile with the warnings drilled into them months before. In the Texan barracks, the collapse of these beliefs happened not in a dramatic instant, but in the quiet moments between routines. A guard who spoke with measured politeness, a meal that arrived warm, not begrudgingly cold, a medical orderly who dressed wounds without commentary. These were small details, almost mundane, but it was precisely their ordinariness that made them difficult to dismiss. The propaganda had promised cruelty. Instead, they found procedure. It had warned of chaos. Instead, they found structure. At night, in the dim light of electric bulbs, conversations drifted through the bunks, soft, uncertain, stripped of bravado. Soldiers who once repeated slogans now asked tentative questions. What else, they wondered, had they accepted without scrutiny? What else had been shaped for them rather than discovered by them? These were not open declarations of doubt. No one stood to renounce anything. But under the surface, convictions that once felt immovable began to loosen. For some, the fracture was painful. Ideology had offered clarity, and clarity had made the world easier to bear. Now the edges of that world no longer aligned with what they observed each day. It was as if the war itself had shifted shape, revealing a reality less absolute than the one they had been taught to defend. And as these quiet uncertainties settled into the barracks, another realization waited just beyond the horizon, one that would challenge not only their beliefs about the enemy, but their understanding of the very nation they had served. For the Americans who designed and managed the prisoner of war system, humane treatment was not an afterthought or a sentimental gesture. It was policy, carefully considered, strategically justified, and rooted in a long tradition of military practicality. From the War Department in Washington to the officers overseeing rural camps in Texas and Oklahoma, the reasoning was clear. The better they treated the Germans, the safer their own captured men would be overseas. Every hot meal served in America was, in a sense, an argument sent across the Atlantic, a message to enemy commanders that reciprocity mattered. It was a calculation shaped not by idealism alone, but by the grim arithmetic of global war. Logistics reinforced this approach. The United States held tens of thousands of prisoners scattered across a continent-sized nation. Punitive chaos, irregular food supplies, improvised punishment regimes, undisciplined violence would have consumed far more resources than order. Military planners understood that predictability was cheaper than brutality. A well-run camp required fewer guards, fewer investigations, fewer emergencies. It could operate almost like a factory, sustained by manuals, timetables, and oversight rather than emotion. Efficiency, not sympathy, built the foundation of the system. Beyond the fences lay another motive, one quieter but no less significant. By 1943, agricultural labor shortages threatened harvests across the Midwest and the South. With millions of American men deployed overseas, farms struggled to maintain production. German prisoners became essential laborers, paid modest wages, and sent to fields under guard. To keep that workforce functioning, they needed to be healthy, steady, and predictable. Punishment offered no return. Nutrition did. It was a straightforward equation. Fed men could work, and working men kept the nation's wartime economy from faltering. Senior generals also believed that discipline grew from order, not cruelty. Many had studied earlier conflicts, noting that armies rooted in stable procedure performed better than those driven by fluctuating emotion. They insisted that moral conduct in wartime was not a sign of softness, but a form of internal cohesion. The Americans wanted a military that could withstand victories without arrogance and defeats without collapse. That required a code, one that extended even to the treatment of enemies. Win the war, a common phrase in officer briefings, but lose no part of our identity. It was an instruction that lingered behind every regulation, every inspection, every directive sent to remote camps. The United States wanted victory, but it wanted to emerge from the conflict without having mirrored the cruelty it fought against. Sustaining dignity, even in the midst of total war, became a strategic act of national self-definition. For the German prisoners observing this system, the effect was unsettling. They had been raised in a political culture where obedience came from fear and authority relied on theater. Now they encountered a different kind of strength, quiet, procedural, unadorned. Decency here was not a mask, it was a mechanism, and its consistency challenged the assumptions they had carried from Europe's battlefields. What they did not yet realize was that this calculated fairness was only the beginning. Beyond labor details and ration schedules lay a deeper revelation, one that would emerge when they stepped outside the camp and into the towns that surrounded it. For a portion of the camp's German officers, the routines of American decency did not inspire reflection, but deepened their defiance. These were men shaped by years of ideological expectation, men who believed that rigidity was a virtue and that loyalty meant refusing even the smallest concession to the enemy. When their captors offered structure instead of cruelty, they did not see principle. They saw an attempt to erode their authority. To them, cooperation was not prudence, but contamination. In the early weeks, they moved through the barracks like self-appointed sentinels, watching for signs of softness among their men. Any prisoner who adapted quickly, who ate without protest, who worked without complaint, who spoke to American guards with measured politeness, was met with suspicion. "Be careful," some officers whispered. "Comfort is a kind of poison." They framed the smallest compromises as moral defeats, accusing younger soldiers of dishonor for accepting what the camp simply provided: order, warmth, and rest. This resistance never erupted into violence, but it emerged in subtler forms, the kind that tested the patience of camp commanders. Tools would disappear after work details, tucked beneath barrack floors. Notes written in faint pencil, harmless in content but unnecessary in secrecy, circulated among the officers as reminders that their allegiance had not shifted. In a few huts, schedules were rearranged without permission, as if they could reclaim authority by disrupting the American timetable. These acts were small, almost symbolic, but they were meant to signal something larger, that ideological discipline still held. The Americans responded not with threats, but with paperwork. Infractions were logged, privileges were suspended, investigations were conducted with clinical regularity. The consequences were procedural: extra inspections, altered work assignments, revoked recreation hours. Camp commanders understood that harsh punishment would create martyrs. Measured enforcement turned defiance into an administrative inconvenience. Each time an officer attempted to provoke drama, he instead encountered an unyielding calm. To the younger enlisted men, this was quietly revelatory. They had lived under a system that equated authority with severity, where discipline was often indistinguishable from fear. Here, in a place defined by confinement, they witnessed another model, one where rules were firm but not cruel, where order did not have to shout to be heard. Some felt a reluctant admiration. Others felt something rarer still: relief. For the officers who still clung to Nazi orthodoxy, that admiration was a threat. Their power, once unquestioned, now began to erode under the weight of predictability. They tried to rally their men with speeches about German honor and American weakness, but the speeches landed differently now. The barracks were warm. The food was plentiful. The guards were composed. Against this backdrop, defiance felt less like courage and more like habit. In private moments, a few officers sensed the ground shifting beneath them. What had been certainty now resembled isolation. Their authority survived in fragments, louder than before, but smaller. And as they watched their men adjust to the routines of captivity, they realized something both unsettling and undeniable. Not every prisoner would follow them into resistance. The belief phase ended with this quiet fracture, and in its wake emerged a new tension, one that would unfold beyond the barracks, where adaptation and refusal would shape the next chapter of their captivity in ways none of them yet understood. At dawn, when the bugle sounded across the compound and the gates swung open, the prisoners discovered that captivity in America did not mean confinement alone. It meant labor, predictable, structured, and woven into the landscape far beyond the barbed wire. Military trucks waited each morning like shuttles between two worlds, the closed German barracks and the open civilian countryside. What began as routine transportation soon became something more significant. Through daily labor assignments, the prisoners were introduced to an America they had never been taught to imagine. Cotton fields were often the first destination. Under the vast southern sky, rows of white bowls stretched toward the horizon like a quiet ocean. The Germans worked in teams, bending, lifting, moving through the field, with the slow rhythm of men unaccustomed to agricultural labor. Yet the work brought a surprising steadiness. There were no shouted threats from guards, no rifles aimed to force speed. Farmers stood nearby with ledger books and sun-darkened faces, observing them with the pragmatic interest of employers, not conquerors. The feeling unsettled the prisoners. They had expected gloating. Instead, they found indifference that bordered on respect. Other days carried them to sawmills, where the air smelled of resin and freshly cut timber. Circular blades whined through pine trunks, the sound echoing like distant machinery of war, but the atmosphere was entirely different. Here, safety rules were repeated with methodical care, as if the Americans felt responsible for the well-being of men who yesterday had fought against them. Gloves were handed out, helmets fitted. The prisoners learned to operate equipment with a precision that surprised even themselves. They were not treated as threats, but as temporary members of a workforce stretched thin by global conflict. In canning plants, the rhythm was industrial, repetitive, metallic, fast. German hands sealed vegetables harvested miles away, stacking crates destined for American soldiers overseas. The irony did not go unnoticed. They were contributing, however indirectly, to the Allied war effort. Yet even this realization carried less emotional weight than the atmosphere around them. Local women working the same lines offered curt nods at first, then occasional remarks. The conversations were brief. Weather, work pace, sometimes a single polite question, but each exchange chipped away at the hardened narratives the prisoners had carried from Europe. Farmers who provided water and food during breaks added another layer of complexity. They brought jugs of cool, well water, baskets of sandwiches, handfuls of fruit in the summer heat. They spoke simply, often without curiosity, as though the notion of feeding enemy soldiers required no explanation. To the Germans, this was perhaps the most disorienting gesture of all, being treated not as invaders or captives, but as hired hands completing necessary work. The boundary between enemy and employee blurred in those moments, softened by the basic needs of harvest and human thirst. As weeks passed, quiet conversations began to cross the cultural gulf. English remained limited, German heavily accented, yet the distance between the two sides narrowed one phrase at a time. A farmer explaining the mechanics of a cotton gin, a German remarking on the heat of a Texas afternoon, a mill worker comparing the hardness of American pine to European spruce. These exchanges were small, almost mundane, but they were the first direct interactions many prisoners had ever had with civilians of a democratic society they had been taught to disdain. Not everything they observed fit neatly into admiration. As they traveled through rural towns, they noticed divisions drawn sharply across racial lines, signs above doorways, segregated seating, patterns of silence that communicated more than words. To men who had lived under a totalitarian ideology of racial hierarchy, the contradiction was striking. America preached equality, yet here was inequality etched into daily life. Some prisoners were puzzled, others silently recognized the parallel. The landscape offered education, but not always reassurance. At the same time, they saw freedoms that challenged the caricature they had absorbed in propaganda halls. Workers argued with supervisors without fear. Newspapers carried criticism of local officials. Churches, barbershops, and general stores displayed opinions that diverged openly from one another. The very casualness of these disagreements unsettled the Germans. They had been told democracies were chaotic because they lacked discipline. Yet here, Disorder did not weaken society, it energized it. These encounters, spread across days of labor and evenings of reflection, formed an unplanned curriculum. No American officer announced lessons. No civilian attempted persuasion. The education came instead from proximity, from the feel of the soil in southern fields, the hum of machinery in sawmills, the conversations at water breaks, the contradictions visible in street corners and storefront windows. And as the prisoners boarded the trucks each afternoon to return to camp, a realization slowly took shape among them, one that unsettled their assumptions far more deeply than the fences and guard towers ever had. They were beginning to understand a world their war had never prepared them to face. What they could not yet foresee was how this quiet exposure would soon intersect with events far beyond the farms, reshaping not only their perception of America, but their understanding of themselves. In the early months of captivity, most German prisoners assumed that the intellectual world of the camp would be barren, empty rooms, scarce paper, and a slow erosion of the mind through monotony. Instead, they found doors opening to shelves of books, organized with the precision of a university archive. The camp libraries were modest in appearance, wooden stacks, creaking floors, dust gathering in sunlit corners, but their contents startled the newcomers. Goethe shared space with Mark Twain. German philosophy lined up beside American history. Medical manuals, engineering texts, and agricultural guides stood ready for hands that had once held rifles. Within weeks, thousands of books had been checked out, their pages traveling from bunk to bunk like quiet contraband of the imagination. Voluntary classes formed next, shaped not by military command, but by opportunity. Literacy courses attracted older soldiers who had never completed formal schooling. Vocational training, carpentry, mechanics, bookkeeping drew younger men eager to reshape idle hours into skill. The classrooms were simple, often repurposed barracks or storage sheds, yet their blackboards filled quickly with diagrams, conjugations, and unfamiliar English phrases. The idea that captivity could become a setting for learning felt almost subversive, as though education were a privilege smuggled into the camp under the guise of routine. German teachers, professors, and students, men captured in Tunisia, Normandy, or the Ardennes, began to reassemble fragments of their old intellectual lives. They formed discussion groups where literature, politics, and history were debated with a rigor they had not dared to exercise openly in recent years. What surprised them most was not the enthusiasm of their fellow prisoners, but the absence of censorship. American officers monitored the sessions to maintain order, but they did not interfere with content. For the first time in a long while, arguments unfolded without fear that a misplaced word would be reported to political overseers. The difference was subtle yet profound. Debate here had rules, not consequences. English classes became some of the most popular. Books of grammar circulated through the camp in worn stacks, pages marked by dozens of hands. Men practiced with dictionaries balanced on their knees, sounding out unfamiliar vowels in low, hesitant tones. They were not learning English for strategic advantage. The war's outcome was already clear. They learned because communication itself had become a bridge, one that allowed them to understand the guards, the farmers, and the society that had revealed itself, piece by piece, since their arrival. Mastering the language felt like stepping closer to the truth of a world that propaganda had once painted in grotesque outlines. In time, camp newspapers emerged, written by prisoners, but reviewed by American officers. The moderation was firm but not oppressive. Articles could critique camp routines, describe work assignments, report on global news, and publish short stories. What they could not do was spread Nazi ideology or incite unrest. Within these boundaries, creativity flourished, satire appeared, poetry returned. Editorials wrestled with questions the prisoners would never have dared to pose back home. What had the war accomplished? What should Germany become when the fighting ended? Each issue reflected a tension between old loyalties and emerging insights, between inherited beliefs and newly observed realities. As this intellectual life expanded, a widening gap became impossible to ignore. The ideological indoctrination that had filled their training halls back in Germany, simple narratives, rigid hierarchies, unquestioned certainty, stood in stark contrast to the democratic discourse developing in the camp. Here, disagreement did not require denunciation. Doubt did not demand punishment. Knowledge moved freely, not by decree. Even those who remained loyal to the old doctrines felt the ground shifting beneath their certainty. Not all prisoners welcomed this shift. Some officers viewed the libraries and classrooms as threats disguised as privileges. They warned their men that democratic debate was a seductive weakness, that the Americans intended to dismantle German discipline by loosening the structures of thought. But the warnings sounded increasingly hollow. The barracks held men who had tasted both systems, the rigid clarity of indoctrination and the uneasy freedom of open discussion, and they could feel the difference even if they could not yet name it. And so, a quiet intellectual struggle unfolded, not between guards and prisoners, but among the prisoners themselves. Books changed hands discreetly. Arguments whispered after lights out lingered long into the night. Minds that had once moved in lockstep began to diverge, uncertain of where the path might lead, but aware that change had already begun. What they did not yet know was that soon, events outside the camp would accelerate this internal reckoning, forcing each man to decide what parts of his old world he could still carry into the future, and what parts he would have to leave behind. In most prisoner-of-war camps throughout history, sound was a reminder of captivity, boots on gravel, keys striking metal, shouted orders echoing through narrow corridors. But in the American camps scattered across the South and Midwest, a different sound gradually rose each evening. Music. It began tentatively, with a few men humming familiar melodies at dusk, their voices carried softly on the dry Texas wind. Soon, guards noticed, and instead of silencing the men, they allowed it to continue, then quietly encouraged it. The boundary between discipline and expression bent, not as an indulgence, but as recognition of something universally human. Orchestras formed first. Violins and accordions arrived through the Red Cross, protected in wooden crates stamped with neutral markings. Prisoners unwrapped them with the reverence of men handling fragile memory. They tuned the strings carefully, tightening pegs, warming reeds, coaxing old tones from instruments that had crossed oceans. Clarinetists fashioned reeds from thin slivers of cane. Percussionists improvised drums from barrels and canvas. The Americans watched with a kind of detached curiosity as entire ensembles reassembled themselves from the fragments of wartime displacement. By late afternoon, music drifted through the compound in layers, violins practicing scales, tubas tuning their deep, resonant hum, voices rising in disciplined unison from makeshift choir lofts built above barrack entrances. The repertoire was wide and surprisingly ungoverned. Schubert Lieder carried through open windows, mingling with German folk songs and the occasional hymn. What startled the guards most, however, was the emergence of improvised jazz, syncopated rhythms, bent notes, and melodies shaped by a distinctly American musical language that the prisoners embraced with unexpected eagerness. Jazz had been condemned by the Reich as degenerate. Here, in captivity, it became a subtle form of liberation. For the American guards, These rehearsals softened the sharp line between custodian and captive. They found themselves pausing at choreographed moments, after roll call, after work details, to listen. Some leaned against fence posts, rifles slung casually at their sides, quietly absorbing the strains of a waltz or the familiar arc of a Beethoven phrase. Music became a shared space where authority mattered less than the simple experience of sound. It did not erase the war, but it briefly suspended its harshest divisions. Occasionally, the camp commandants approved evening concerts. These were structured events, wooden benches arranged in neat rows, floodlights illuminating a stage built of planks. The audience included guards, officers, and, on select nights, invited townspeople from nearby communities. At first, the civilians attended out of curiosity, unsure of what it meant to listen to the music of captured soldiers. But when the orchestra began, when strings rose in disciplined harmony and brass instruments filled the humid evening air, something shifted. The distance between the barbed wire and the town narrowed. Applause echoed back across the yard. For prisoners accustomed to the orchestrated noise of propaganda rallies, where music served as a tool for emotional control rather than artistic expression, this cultural freedom felt radical. Songs were chosen by the performers, not dictated by ideology. Audiences listened because they wished to, not because attendance was compulsory. Even the silence between movements carried meaning. It was a silence of attention, not fear. Each concert was a quiet rebuke to the cultural rigidity they had once accepted without question. Within the barracks, music fostered new conversations. Men debated composers, compared interpretations, and shared memories of performances back home, memories that stretched across classrooms, concert halls, and small village gatherings. Younger soldiers who had known only the militarized culture of their training years began to see that art survived even in captivity. It softened tempers, bridged disagreements, and offered a glimpse of lives they might lead once the war ended. Some officers resisted these developments, claiming that music dulled vigilance and eroded discipline. But their voices grew quieter as the months passed. The orchestras did not weaken morale. They complicated it. They opened space for reflection, for doubt, for a sense of identity that reached beyond uniform and ideology. And so, without intention or orchestration from above, music became the camp's most powerful educator. It crossed fences that regulations could not breach, shaping thoughts not through argument but through resonance. By the time summer settled over the compound and concerts became a nightly ritual, the prisoners sensed that their transformation was no longer driven by force. It came from ideas, absorption, and the slow reshaping of the self, changes carried not by commands, but by the notes that drifted into the dimming light and stayed with them long after the last chord faded. The first hints arrived quietly, carried not by official announcement, but by the low murmur of guard chatter drifting across the work sites. Names of distant cities surfaced in these conversations: Cherbourg, Caen, Aachen, spoken with a tone that suggested movement, momentum, a slow but certain shift in the war's direction. The Germans listened without appearing to, pretending to focus on cotton rows or lumber piles while absorbing each fragment of overheard news. At first, they dismissed it as American exaggeration, yet the cadence never changed. Every week, the advances grew closer. Every mention carried the same steady confidence, as if the tide of war were rolling toward them in waves too large to ignore. Newspapers followed, delivered to the camp with their front pages carefully reviewed by military censors. But the censors removed little. Headlines spoke clearly: Allied landings in France, Soviet breakthroughs in the East, German units withdrawing across terrain they had once claimed with triumph. For some prisoners, The sight of these reports produced a tightening in the chest, a feeling that reality was slipping out of their grasp. They studied the articles line by line, searching for misprints, distortions, anything to weaken the impact. None appeared. The facts stood quietly, and that quietness made them more convincing than any propaganda ever had. Then came the letters, folded paper carried across oceans and continents, written in the cramped script of families living beneath air raids. Many arrived stained, sometimes with water, sometimes with dust, and occasionally with a silence that was harder to bear than any sentence withheld. Photographs fell from envelopes, streets reduced to rubble, roofs caved in, familiar buildings transformed into skeletal frames. Mothers wrote of nights spent in basements, brothers described shortages, wives mentioned friends who had disappeared, a euphemism both sides understood, without explanation. The images traveled from bunk to bunk, each man holding them with the reverence normally reserved for relics, and with each picture, the myth of invulnerability dissolved a little more. German officers sensed their authority slipping. Where they once maintained order through certainty, now uncertainty seeped into every directive. Roll calls became tense affairs, with whispered questions emerging in the lines. Is it true? Has Dortmund fallen? What of the Eastern Front? Officers tried to suppress these doubts with sharp commands, but their voices lacked the conviction that had once made obedience instinctive. The younger soldiers saw it clearly. The men who had warned them never to believe Allied reports were now struggling to believe their own explanations. The Americans made no attempt to shield the prisoners from the truth. Their censorship was minimal, their supervision unobtrusive. They trusted the facts to perform the work that argument could not. It was a strategic choice, perhaps even a psychological one, but it carried no cruelty. They did not gloat, they did not lecture. When prisoners approached guards with hesitant questions, the answers were simple, often just a nod or a date. Reality, presented plainly, required no embellishment. As the scale of Germany's collapse became undeniable, the mood within the barracks fractured. Some prisoners fell into silence, eating quickly and returning to their bunks as if hoping sleep might slow the advance of events unfolding thousands of miles away. Others argued late into the night, clinging to hopes of a secret weapon or a last-minute reversal. A handful, driven more by desperation than strategy, attempted escape. They slipped into the fields or wooded areas near the camp, believing they might somehow reach Mexico, or a port, or simply a stretch of open land where time could be paused. Few made it far. Most surrendered themselves again, exhausted, admitting that their flight had been less about reaching Germany than about fleeing the truth inside the wire. For many, the turning point arrived without ceremony. It came in the quiet realization that the war they had imagined, the one filled with certainty, with inevitable victory, with ideological destiny, no longer existed. What remained was a homeland collapsing faster than any of them had believed possible, and a future that would not be forged on the battlefields they once trained for, but in a place they had never intended to remain. And as the prisoners confronted this shift, a new understanding settled over the camp like an evening shadow. Whatever came next, rebuilding, reckoning, or return, would begin here, not in the ruins of the world they left behind. As the war's direction became undeniable, the tension that had smoldered quietly within the camp began to burn in unmistakable lines. Ideology, once held together by distance from the front and the illusions of propaganda, now fractured into two opposing currents. On one side were the prisoners who still clung to loyalty, some out of conviction, others out of fear of losing the identity they had carried into the war. On the other were those who could no longer ignore the evidence before them, men who sensed that the regime they had served was collapsing not only militarily, but morally. The camp's barracks, once arranged by rank, gradually reorganized themselves around belief. The first confrontations were subtle, whispered accusations during evening roll call, long stares across the mess hall, notes passed through bunk rows warning men to remember their oath. But soon, subtlety gave way to confrontation. Pro-Nazi factions threatened those who questioned the war's purpose. Anti-Nazi prisoners, suddenly more visible, pushed back with guarded defiance. Both sides believed they were defending Germany, but the definition of that word had diverged sharply. What had begun as ideological tension now carried the distinct edge of danger. American guards, though outside the conflict, could feel the shift. They noticed groups forming in the yard, officers speaking to enlisted men in hushed, fervent tones, and individuals avoiding certain barracks altogether. The guards moved carefully. They understood that this was not a disciplinary issue, but a political one, too volatile for heavy-handed intervention, yet too dangerous to ignore. When fights broke out, they broke them up swiftly, but they also recognized that these altercations were symptoms, not causes. Some prisoners, fearing violence from their own officers, approached the Americans with quiet, reluctant requests for protection. These were not dramatic confessions, but small, trembling steps made late at night. A man asking to be reassigned to a different work crew, another begging to be moved away from a superior who had begun to issue threats. For soldiers raised to see surrender as dishonor, asking the enemy for safety was a gesture heavy with humiliation. Yet they came, one by one, then in small groups, seeking a refuge they could not find among their own. The Americans responded with a mixture of caution and procedure. Under their oversight, hearings were established, court-martial-style sessions designed to determine responsibility for violence or intimidation within the camp. The process was formal, yet restrained, conducted in makeshift offices with translated testimony and standardized questions. These hearings did not resemble the authoritarian discipline the prisoners had known in the Wehrmacht. There were no shouted accusations, no preordained punishments. Evidence was considered. Witnesses were heard. Outcomes were documented. For many Germans, this was their first encounter with a form of justice unshaped by ideology. Over time, the camps became microcosms of a Germany that no longer existed as they had known it. The old system, order descending from rigid hierarchy, could not contain the new reality. Instead, debates about the future of their nation unfolded at mess tables, in work crews, and in the dim spaces between bunks after lights out. Some clung to the belief that loyalty meant obedience until the end. Others argued that loyalty demanded honesty, even if that honesty meant acknowledging the regime's crimes. The very definition of patriotism had become contested ground. A few prisoners took the step that many others feared. They renounced the regime openly. They spoke plainly about the failure of its promises, the futility of its ambitions, and the immorality of its methods. These declarations carried personal risk, retaliation from their own officers, ostracism from former comrades, but the men who made them seemed to have crossed a threshold inside themselves. Once they had acknowledged the truth, they could not retreat from it. In the barracks, these moments of renunciation echoed louder than any official statement from the outside world. As the ideological conflict intensified, the Americans watched carefully, aware that they were witnessing a process far larger than the camp itself. Germany's collapse was not only military or political, it was moral, and the struggle now unfolding inside the barbed wire was a distillation of that reckoning, a confrontation between belief and reality, pride and conscience, past and future. By the end of the summer, one fact had become undeniable. The battle many prisoners were fighting was no longer against the Allies, but against the truths they had once denied. And as this internal conflict reached its peak, the next phase of their transformation waited just beyond the camp gates, where news from Europe would soon deliver a final shattering blow to the world they had believed unchangeable. On the morning of May 8, 1945, the camp awoke to a sound unlike any it had heard before. It came first as a scattered burst of voices from the guard towers, then as a rising swell from the administrative buildings near the gate. VE Day, victory in Europe, had been announced. For the American soldiers, the news carried relief, triumph, and the promise of going home. Some cheered openly, tossing caps into the air, their joy echoing across the yard, with the unguarded warmth of men who had survived what others had not. Inside the barracks, the reaction was different. Silence spread in slow, deliberate waves. Prisoners sat on their bunks or stood with hands resting on the rough wooden frames, absorbing the meaning of a war that had ended without them. There were no shouts, no cries, no gestures of rebellion or collapse, just a stillness that felt almost ceremonial. The men who had once marched behind banners now faced a future without direction. The surrender of Germany was not merely a military event, it was a personal unraveling. Uncertainty settled over them like a sudden change in weather. What awaited them in the place they still called home, though it no longer resembled the country they had left? Letters hinted at ruins. Photographs confirmed it. Now the questions sharpened. Would their families recognize them? Would their towns still exist? And perhaps most unsettling of all, after years spent in a world shaped by American rules, order, and unexpected generosity, how would they reintegrate into a Germany that had been shattered morally as well as physically? That afternoon, American officers assembled the prisoners for a formal announcement. The briefing was delivered with a clarity that avoided triumphalism. There were no gestures of superiority, no reminders of defeat. Instead, the officers outlined what the surrender meant, how international agreements would govern the next steps, and what responsibilities the United States now carried as a detaining power. Many prisoners were struck by the tone, concise, respectful, almost administrative. It was the same consistency they had witnessed since their arrival, now applied to the most consequential moment of their captivity. In some camps, the commandants allowed solemn commemorations, simple gatherings in open fields, where prisoners and guards stood at a distance, united in a quiet recognition of the dead on both sides. Small wooden crosses were placed in the soil. Hymns were sung without rank or ideology. For a few minutes, the war's divisions loosened, replaced by a shared understanding of loss. It was an act unthinkable in the world the prisoners had come from, and it lingered in their memory with an intensity that surprised them. But with the commemoration came a more private question, whispered in barracks long after lights out. Would returning to Germany erase what they had learned here? The routines of the camp, the order, the debates, the exposure to ideas forbidden back home, had shaped them in subtle but profound ways. They wondered whether those changes could survive the pressures of a society rebuilding itself from rubble, grief, and political uncertainty. Some feared that they would revert to the men they had been before capture. Others feared they could not. Formal repatriation planning began soon after. Transport lists were drawn up. Health examinations were conducted with the same clinical diligence the Americans had used from the start. The Geneva Convention became the framework guiding each decision, ensuring that return would be orderly and lawful. For many prisoners, this adherence to process reinforced the contrast between the two systems they had experienced. Even in victory, the Americans followed rules. It was a lesson that did not arrive with speeches, but with procedure. In the final weeks before departure, the camp took on a tone of quiet reflection. Men walked the perimeter not to measure the distance to freedom, but to commit to memory the strange landscape in which they had been reshaped. They lingered in the library, returned borrowed tools to the workshops, and played final concerts that drifted into the evening air with a blend of melancholy and gratitude. The life they had lived inside the wire, structured, consistent, unexpectedly expansive, was ending, and as the gates prepared to open, one truth settled over them with undeniable weight. Captivity had changed them more deeply than the front lines ever had. The war outside had collapsed their nation. The war inside had altered their understanding of it. What they faced next, reintegration, reconstruction, or quiet reckoning, would unfold far from the Texan soil beneath their feet, where the seeds of transformation had taken root long before they realized they were growing. The journey home began not with celebration, but with the steady thrum of engines echoing across the Atlantic. The ships that carried them westward years earlier, in fear, in uncertainty, in captivity, now carried them eastward in a silence shaped by reflection. They stood along the railings, watching the horizon expand and contract as the vessel cut through long winter swells. For many, the ocean crossing felt like a passage between two selves, the soldiers who had left Germany believing in a triumphant future, and the men now returning to a nation defeated in both landscape and spirit. When the ships reached Europe's shattered ports, the first sight of home struck with a force more profound than any battlefield memory. Cities they had known as vibrant, Bremen, Hamburg, Cologne, stood now as expanses of ash fields and broken stone. Streets once lined with familiar shops had become pathways through ruins. Church towers were split open, factory walls peeled back by blast waves, and entire neighborhoods flattened into gray dust. The smell was not of smoke, but of damp masonry and the quiet aftermath of fire long extinguished. These were not the cities they had defended in thought. These were the remnants of a world that had collapsed while they were learning English verbs and repairing farm machinery under American oversight. Their families' faces revealed another truth. The prisoners had changed in ways that those who remained could not easily understand. Some Germans greeted the returning men with suspicion, concerned by their stories of humane treatment, structured debate, and unexpected freedom inside American camps. To speak admiringly of the enemy felt dangerous in a society still sorting through layers of trauma, pride, and loss. Rumors spread quickly. Former POWs had been softened or re-educated or had forgotten their duty. The men who had once worn uniforms with unquestioned authority now found themselves treated as strangers in their own homes, yet others sought them out deliberately. Teachers, emerging political leaders, and curious neighbors listened closely as these former prisoners described camp libraries, municipal systems, and the procedural logic of American institutions. The war had ended, but the need for reconstruction, physical, political, moral, had only begun. These men brought back not blueprints, but habits, respect for rules that were not imposed through fear, the value of open discussion, and the quiet efficiency of shared civic responsibility. Their words carried weight precisely because they had learned these lessons while living behind wire, in a place where freedom was limited but order was unmistakably coherent. Reintegration remained uneven. Germany's economy was in ruins, housing was scarce, families were scattered. Some returning POWs found work in farms or factories with relative ease, welcomed for their discipline and familiarity with American machinery. Others drifted through the rubble, unable to reclaim the lives they had lost. Political suspicion shadowed them in both directions, by those who feared their democratic leanings and by those who doubted their break from the old ideology. The camps had reshaped them, but the world to which they returned had not yet decided whether that transformation was an asset or a threat. Still, something subtle endured from their years of captivity. It emerged in the way they organized community rebuilding, methodically, without the rigid authoritarianism that had structured their early training. They formed committees, held local meetings, and addressed shortages through shared decision-making rather than directive or decree. In villages where leadership had vanished, former POWs often stepped forward, not with bravado, but with quiet competence. The steadiness they had learned in fields and workshops in Texas became a practical tool in neighborhoods searching for direction. Some wives noticed changes before their husbands spoke a word, a gentler patience, a slower temper, a willingness to listen. These were not the transformations of propaganda, but of lived experience, shaped in places far from the collapsing fronts of Europe. The war had taken much from them, yet captivity had given them something unexpected, perspective, and so the consequence phase began, not with displays of triumph or shame, but with tension, a deep and persistent pull between the Germany they had left behind and the one they had found upon return. The past lay in ruins. The future waited in uncertainty. What they carried back from the camps would shape which direction they moved. What they did not yet realize was that the final test was still ahead, unfolding not on foreign soil, but in the fragile space between memory and rebuilding. In the years immediately following the war, as Germany staggered through the long and uneven work of reconstruction, the former prisoners of war returned to civilian life with a clarity that set them apart. Many were young enough to begin again. Others were old enough to know precisely what had been lost. Yet across villages, towns, and cities still marked by rubble, a quiet pattern emerged. These former POWs, men who had once labored in American cotton fields, studied English in makeshift classrooms, or listened to jazz drifting across the camp yard, now became teachers, tradesmen, foremen, and local officials. Their roles were modest, often unnoticed at first, but their influence grew steadily, shaped not by authority, but by experience. When they spoke of America, their stories carried an unfamiliar tone, not admiration, exactly, and not nostalgia. Rather, a factual recollection of fairness that contradicted the propaganda many Germans still half believed. They told of meals served on time and without contempt, of rules applied evenly, of guards who enforced discipline with professionalism rather than anger. These accounts were met with raised eyebrows, sometimes even distrust, but the men did not dramatize their memories. Instead, they spoke with the calm cadence of those whose convictions had been formed slowly, through repetition rather than revelation. Local officials, mayors in provisional offices, school administrators working with salvaged materials, noticed something else. Former POWs had a steadiness uncommon in a society still wrestling with scarcity and shock. They arrived punctually. They followed procedures without resentment. They participated in civic meetings with a seriousness shaped by the libraries, debates, and hearings they had known behind barbed wire. American administrators in occupied Germany recognized this reliability almost immediately. Many of these men were recruited into municipal services, agricultural offices, and reconstruction programs where trust mattered more than ideology. They had, in effect, been trained by their captors, not in loyalty, but in order. Years later, researchers studying post-war civic development would find a pattern that many local leaders had already sensed. Interviews, surveys, and sociological analyses revealed that the POW camp experience had left a measurable imprint on democratic attitudes. Men who spent years in American custody tended to vote more consistently, engage more reliably in community decisions, and support decentralized authority. They were not perfect advocates of democracy. The scars of war ran too deep for simple conclusions. Yet something fundamental had shifted. They had lived under a system where power did not require fear, where justice did not require spectacle, and where the rules held even in victory. This memory endured long after their return. Some maintained correspondence with American civilians they had met during labor details, farmers who brought them water, sawmill owners who trusted them with machinery, or families who attended camp concerts out of curiosity. Letters traveled slowly across the Atlantic, often opened by customs officials, yet they carried the warmth of an unlikely connection. The Germans wrote of rebuilding homes and ration cards. The Americans wrote of harvests, elections, and children, now old enough to read. These exchanges were not political. They were human, and in their simplicity, they affirmed a truth the former prisoners had already sensed. Respect, once experienced, does not vanish easily. In quieter moments, the men found themselves returning to memories that might have seemed trivial to outsiders. The shock of a hot meal served without scorn, the reassurance of a doctor treating them before treating himself, the unexpected dignity of learning a skill in a camp classroom. These recollections did not glorify captivity. Rather, they grounded the men in a lived contrast between the authoritarian discipline they had known as soldiers and the procedural fairness they had encountered in America. It was this contrast, not lectures or leaflets, that guided many of their choices in the years that followed. As Germany's reconstruction accelerated, these former prisoners became carriers of a new ethos. They taught apprentices with patience they had once lacked. They moderated village disputes with a calmness born of watching American officers handle conflicts without fury. They insisted on rules that applied equally to all, not because it was fashionable, but because they had witnessed the power of such rules in a place designed to confine them. In the small civic spaces that define a society, school boards, trade guilds, municipal committees, they acted as quiet stabilizers. This perhaps was the irony none of them could have predicted. The strength they had once associated with command and fear now appeared in a different form: restraint, fairness, and consistency. The very qualities they had initially mistrusted in captivity became the foundations upon which they rebuilt their communities. And as the consequences of the war unfolded across the fractured landscape of post-war Germany, a moral closure began to take shape, one built not on triumph or defeat, but on the lasting imprint of humanity shown in the most unlikely of circumstances. In the decades that followed the war, as Germany rebuilt itself from ruins into a modern nation, the memories carried by former prisoners of war did not fade into obscurity. Instead, they resurfaced in memoirs written at kitchen tables, in retirement homes, or during late-night hours when the past pressed itself forward with unexpected clarity. Across these accounts, one theme appeared with striking consistency: the shock of being treated as human during a conflict that had dehumanized millions. The words varied: astonishment, disorientation, relief, but the meaning was the same. Captivity had not broken them. It had confronted them. Their grandchildren heard these stories in fragments, often delivered with the measured tone of men who had lived long enough to understand the complexity of their own experiences. They spoke not of victories or losses, but of paradox, of a captivity that had restored a measure of dignity the war itself had stripped away. Some recalled the first hot meal in Texas, steam rising into the dry air. Others remembered the showers, the libraries, the evenings filled with music drifting over the camp yard. What astonished the younger generations was not simply the kindness the prisoners described, but the sincerity with which they confessed its impact. Historians, looking back with the advantage of distance, began to see patterns that contemporaries could not. They analyzed documents, correspondence, and post-war political records, tracing how exposure to procedural fairness influenced civic participation in the decades that followed. Many of the former POWs became early adopters of democratic habits in a country, learning to practice them anew, attending meetings, voting regularly, serving in local councils. Scholars noted that humane treatment had generated something that no propaganda campaign could have produced, a lived contrast between two systems, one grounded in fear, the other in rules applied with restraint. From that contrast, trust grew, not in the sense of blind loyalty, but in the more measured belief that power could exist without cruelty. And beneath these academic findings lay quieter, more personal revelations. Survivors admitted, sometimes reluctantly, that their years in captivity had challenged the worldview they once carried with unwavering certainty. They had arrived believing they understood the enemy, only to discover that the enemy's restraint revealed more strength than violence ever had. Some wrote that the experience forced them to think, a phrase simple on the surface, but profound for men whose early lives had unfolded under a regime that punished independent thought. Others described a moment, often during work in the fields or conversations in camp classrooms, when they realized the ideology they once accepted had not prepared them to understand the world as it truly was. With time, their memories circled back to those first bewildering days inside the camps, the unexpected gesture of a guard offering a cigarette, the silence of discipline rather than the noise of rage. The feeling of confusion that accompanied the first orderly meal served without contempt. These moments, trivial in isolation, accumulated into something far larger. They marked the beginning of a transformation the prisoners did not recognize until years later, when distance allowed them to see how profound the shift had been. And so the narrative returns to where it began, the gates of the camp opening to men who expected blows, only to receive decency instead. What unfolded afterward, labor, debate, tension, collapse, rebuilding, stemmed from that initial reversal. The war had brought them across an ocean, but it was the experience of fair treatment that carried them across the far greater distance between belief and understanding. For in the end, the story's final irony stands unshaken. Strength did not reveal itself through domination. Transformation did not come through punishment or coercion. It arrived gently, almost imperceptibly, in the form of respect shown to defeated men, respect they had been taught never to expect and rarely to give. They arrived expecting cruelty. Instead, they found a lesson that would outlive the war.